Today we welcome back Neal Thompson. I presume every war has its critics, and perhaps none more so than Vietnam. He's going to talk about the war crimes industry. Neal?
And by the way, I just read Spearhead, and it is very good. Good afternoon. I'm going to talk a little about something that is rather near and dear to my heart. It always has been, and that's what Professor Gunter Louis labeled the war crimes industry. Now, this arose in connection with the Vietnam War, and it started primarily because the anti-war forces seemed to be unable to convince the American people with reason, critique, or argument that we didn't belong in Vietnam and that we should get out of Vietnam. And pretty soon, rather than reason and sensible critique, it descended into criminalizing rather than critiquing the war. Everything I'm about to say, these are all quotes from various celebrities and anti-war pundits. They said that this country had legitimized murder and expanded murder into genocide. We conducted a monstrous and intentionally genocidal air war, complete with the day and night bombing of hamlets filled with women, children, and the old, dropping an enormous weight of explosives on purely civilian targets, and we engaged in the massive use of cruel tactics indiscriminately against the civilian population in flagrant violation of the minimum rules of war. George McGovern, who was a decorated World War II veteran with considerable credibility, said that we were engaged in the most immoral action this nation has ever committed in its national history, and he called it a policy of mass murder. John Kerry, of course, former Senator and Secretary of State, appeared before the Senate, and I'm quoting him now, he told them that Americans who served in Vietnam, quote, personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals, and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blew up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, razed villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan, shot cattle and dogs for fun, poisoned food stocks, and generally ravaged the countryside of South Vietnam. He stressed that he was ashamed of his service, and he said, and this is crucial, these were not isolated incidents, but crimes committed on a day-to-day basis with the full awareness of the officers at all levels of command. He then warned Americans that in their veterans, millions of men taught to deal and trade in violence, this country had created a monster. There was an activist named Peter Marin who summed it all up in The Nation, and I'll quote him as well. There are other elements that make the Vietnam War different from and even worse than other wars. Even now, most Americans do not realize the extent to which it was marked by arbitrary killing and the murder of civilians. It was a war in which innocence became fair game and in which our soldiers found themselves perceived by the civilian population as intruders, conquerors, and even murderers. It was a bad war, fought for all the wrong reasons and in all the wrong ways. Now, needless to say, the veterans ultimately paid quite a price for this. Frederick Downs lost his left arm to a mine near Tam Key, and he was attending classes at Denver in the fall of '68, and a fellow student pointed to the hook extending from his left sleeve and asked him if he'd gotten it in Vietnam. When he told him that he had, the student said, "Serves you right." Gil Dorland, and I will quote him as well, wrote of an experience he had in 1968. In 1968, while on convalescent leave in Nashville, I witnessed one of the most egregious acts that I have ever seen before or witnessed since. In front of a packed auditorium at Vanderbilt University, the anti-war activist and Yale University chaplain Dr. William Sloane Coffin verbally dismembered a young veteran for voicing that he was proud to have fought for this country in Vietnam. The audience of intelligent Americans was on its feet, hooting and jeering the soldier. I thought they were going to lynch him. Then I saw his legs. They were cut off at the thighs, blown off via VC landmine. Now this is somewhat atypical, but not that unusual, as Bob Greene noted in a book called Homecoming, in which he had 120 veterans talk about bad receptions they'd gotten when they came home. And the fact is that if the men who fought in Vietnam behaved this way, if they did act like the Japanese in China, then they deserve what they get. They're not entitled to any honor. They're not entitled to any respect. The question is, did they really do any of this? Is any of this true? And the problem with trying to critique this, what we call the war crimes industry, is that it's almost impossible to prove non-events. How do I prove that something didn't happen, which by its very nature leaves no evidence? Well, what I determined in writing my own book was that you have to examine the claims they make and bring some judgment and some analysis to what they're saying, and you find time and time again that whatever claims you hear about all our terrible crimes, they're false. The first complete book dedicated to the war crimes industry was by a gentleman named Mark Lane, who wrote Conversations with Americans. And it was described as follows: a generation is being brutalized. 32 Vietnam veterans give firsthand accounts of what is happening to our under 30s as they are trained in savagery, sadism, torture, terrorism, and murder. Now, it's all very powerful. It's 247 pages of this, but the problem with Mark Lane was that he allowed enough detail that his claims could be checked, the veterans could be checked, and Neal F, who wrote Bright and Shining Lie, did just that, and found that consistently they weren't who they said they were, or they couldn't have been where they said they were, or did what they said they did. One veteran claimed that he knew the commander of the 11th ACR had been a senior officer in the SS. Well, that's a stupid claim and easily disproven. Another one claimed that his battalion, his entire battalion, had raped a Vietnamese girl. This is like 800 men, really? And when Neal F confronted Mark Lane with the fact that everything he said in this book was false, Mark Lane said, and this is crucial to remember, it's not relevant. It doesn't matter whether it's true because they're writing for politics and ideology, not historical fact. Next, of course, we had these winter soldier hearings that VVAW put on. Now, they put on in Detroit. They had 120 veterans come in and tell all these terrible stories of things they'd done. And it's important to note that one of the organizers was Mark Lane. Now, Mark Lane learned from Conversations with Americans, and they were very careful when they presented this to ensure that the claims could not be verified or discounted by anyone. That's the way they presented their men. They said that they intended to present it in such a way that you either took it at face value or you didn't. The point of this is that no responsible journalist or historian will take anything said at these hearings at face value, not when they're deliberately made so that you can't verify them. And then we had, and this is one of the very best, in 1988, Dan Rather presented a program called The Wall Within. This was an hour-long program on primetime television where he presented several, your media classic Vietnam veterans. They're all deranged, they're living out in the woods. And these are just some of them. For example, a guy named Steve claimed to have been a 16-year-old Navy SEAL. That should give you some idea how stupid this is. He said that under direct orders, he operated behind enemy lines for 2 years, murdering and mutilating civilians and making it look like the VC had done it. He was driven to alcohol and drug addiction, came home in a straitjacket, and almost strangled his mother because he mistook her for the Viet Cong. There was Mr. Rather presented Terry Bradley, who claimed to have murdered and skinned civilians, including women and baby, at a rate of up to 50 an hour. An individual named Michael Rice told Rather of all the trauma he experienced when his best friend died in his arms from a grenade. Well, a review of their military record showed that Steve, the 16-year-old mass-murdering Navy SEAL, was Stephen Earl Southards. He did not enlist at 16, he was not a Navy SEAL, and he saw no combat. He was an internal communications technician who served in rear areas and spent most of his time in the brig or AWOL. Terry Bradley, who was the guy murdering and skinning all the civilians, was an ammunition handler in the rear, not a combat soldier at the front. He spent 300 days either AWOL or in the stockade. That's quite a record when you realize a tour in Vietnam is only 365 days long. He was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which is an organic brain disorder that has nothing to do with combat. Michael Rice served as a guard at a military police company in Cam Ranh Bay. There was no sergeant killed when he was in Vietnam. It's all nonsense. And this was determined by a gentleman named B.G. Burkitt, who wrote Stolen Valor, How the Vietnam Generation Was Robbed of Its Heroes and Its History. And this is what he noted. I, a rank amateur, have been able to verify with several phone calls and a FOIA request that the description Steve gave of his military service and his tales of atrocities were fraudulent. No one, however, at CBS will talk about this. And Dan Rather, when Burkitt tried to talk to him, he won't answer the phone. So this is an hour of primetime television, and every bit of it was nonsense. All you have to do when you get these atrocity stories is make a FOIA request. My entire personnel file is a public record, as is yours. All anybody's got to do is request it. And if I say I was with the 101st Airborne and I was a door gunner and involved in all these crimes, all you've got to do is look at the records and find that I was an ammunition handler in Saigon. But they didn't do it before they presented this to a national audience. Now, in the world of books, written seriously and meant to be taken seriously, nothing better represents the war crimes industry than Myra McPherson's long time passing, Vietnam and the Haunted Generation. She's got 600 pages of material demonstrating that we're all losers and outcasts, morons and drug addicts and criminals. And all you have to do for the full flavor of this book is read the chapter titles. A Different War, Post-Traumatic Stress, The Afflicted, The Criminals, The Disordered, Atrocities, The Deserters, Drugs, Bad Paper, and Prison. Now, according to Myra McPherson, atrocities are the thread that runs through everybody's experience in Vietnam. Atrocities are what we all did all day, and atrocities are why we have chapters on the afflicted and the disordered and the criminals. Now, of course, like any other entry in the war crimes industry, this received rave reviews from all the usual suspects. Senator Tom Harkin called it powerful and relevant reading. George McGovern said it was a most perceptive and fascinating account. Ted Kennedy called it a brilliant evocation and a moving story, and historian Stanley Karnow called it a portrait of America in our time. The problem is, like the rest of it, it's nonsense. Now, I'll just give you 3 examples. Literally, I could stand here for an hour and tick through these, but one of her poor suffering heroes is Steven Citraszewski. He talks about how he awakens with PTSD and he has nightmares and he looks for snipers in the road. But his service record shows that he was a supply clerk with the 9th Infantry Division. No combat, no medals, just an endless charade, and probably money from the VA for his PTSD. McPherson also presented a Gerald Hyman, a twice wounded former Marine who suffered from 10 years of depression and flashbacks. One morning, Hyman killed his wife and then killed himself. His official service record shows no combat action ribbon, no Purple Heart, no wounds, no hospital stays. He was an office machine repairman who fixed typewriters and mimeograph machines in the rear. Now, it's a shame that anyone loses his mind and kills himself, but it had nothing to do with Vietnam. It's not what was presented. Lastly, she presents us with a gent named Eddie Erickson. His wife found him dead in a closet, where he hanged himself because of trauma he suffered as a door gunner with the 101st Airborne. It was particularly devastating were his memories of the day his best friend Michael Murphy was shot and fell from a helicopter. And when he returned to base, Erickson found a letter that his best friend's wife had just written him telling him that he'd had a son. The problem is, of course, that it's all nonsense. Erickson was a machinist with headquarters company of the 159th Aviation Battalion. He didn't fly combat. He didn't receive any air medals. It was all nonsense. Now, I don't know why you find so many of these veterans who lose their minds or why they all claim that it was due to trauma in Vietnam. But the fact is, you can't take these stories as true. You can't take them at face value, and no responsible historian would ever do so. Now, my favorite cog in the machine of the war crimes industry is one of the latest books that has been written, and I really had a time with this one. It does more to prove how well-behaved Americans in Vietnam were than any other thing I've ever written. It's called The War Behind Me. Vietnam Veterans Confront the Truth About U.S. War Crimes. This was published by Professor Deborah Nelson in 2008. Now, she's a professor of investigative journalism at Philip Merrill College, and she is a particularly nasty character who has spent half her adult life writing magazine articles and books and newspaper articles bashing the men who served in Vietnam as criminals. And she admits in her book she's a baby boomer who opposed the war, and she wrote the book primarily as political retaliation because John Kerry lost the 2004 campaign. A lot of people attribute a considerable part of his loss to Vietnam, the Swipboat Veterans for Truth, who attacked his record and attacked him. So this is really, it's politically motivated and it's retaliatory in nature. And what she found is fascinating. She reviewed 246 official U.S. Army files containing documentation of crimes committed by men in Vietnam, murder, torture, sexual assault. And according to her analysis, 300 of the allegations were sustained. Now, this is the way she describes it. These records constitute, quote, an unparalleled body of evidence comprising 9,000 pages implicating U.S. troops in a wide range of atrocities, a My Lai a month. Now that really sounds devastating. It sounds powerful. It's very impressive. But what we need to do is a little math. Now, I prosecuted financial crimes for years, and I used to love it because these people are so stupid. And the claims they make for the money they steal or the way they try to hide it are just, it's fascinating. And I prosecuted one guy. He called himself Sean Penn. That wasn't his name, but that was the name under which he was prosecuted. He worked for a charity, Illinois Federation of Families. He was a full-time student at Western Illinois University, and his job was to use a set of IBM QuickBooks in a laptop. They would send him the invoices, he would write the checks, and load it into the computer. That was his sole job. That's all he had to do. Well, over a 6-week period, and by the way, he stole in total over $100,000. But during one 6-week period, he wrote checks to himself noting that they were travel expenses. Now, the only travel expense anyone at IFF was authorized was 35 cents a mile for using a car. And he's sitting on the stand. I just love these guys. And he's telling this ridiculous story. And he identified all 3 of those checks as travel expenses. And then, as I said, let's do some math. Now, if you are authorized 35 cents a mile and you're paid $6,000, that means you drove about 18,000 miles. 18,000 miles. And if you drive at 60 miles an hour, it requires 300 hours to drive 18,000 miles. And if you do that 8 hours a day, it takes 37 and a half days driving all day to drive 18,000 miles. And I asked him, where were you going? And how did you attend classes? Because for 5 of the 6-week period, you were driving all day. Okay? You do a little math and the stupidity of it all just falls apart. And he sits on the stand like a deer in headlights and shifts his story and says, oh, those were loans. Okay, well, obviously he was found guilty and he went to the penitentiary. Well, doing a little math, let's look at Professor Nelson's work. You always have to have frames of reference. You can't judge anything without a frame of reference. Now, there were 2.6 million Americans stationed in Vietnam during 8 years of combat, when, according to Professor Nelson, she's got 9,000 pages showing that we acted like the Japanese in China. Now, there are 2.6 million people in the city of Chicago. There's a frame of reference. So I went to the official Chicago Police Department reports, and I determined that in 2007 alone, 1 year, now keep in mind, 300 crimes committed by guys in Vietnam, 2.6 million over an 8-year period. In 2007 alone, there were 34,895 violent crimes in the city of Chicago. 95 every single day. If you look at the statistics today, somebody is shot every 2 hours, somebody is shot to death every 12 hours in Chicago. Now, the crimes committed in 2007 included 442 murders, 1,600 criminal sexual assaults, 15,246 robberies, and 17,000 aggravated assaults and batteries, 16,834 of which involved guns, knives, and other dangerous weapons. This means that there were 116 times the number of violent crimes committed by, between, and among the citizens of Chicago in a 1-year period than were committed by 2.6 million Americans over an 8-year period in Southeast Asia. That's where her numbers get you. During an 8-year period in the city of Chicago, 2000 to 2007, there were 323,787 violent crimes in Chicago. That means that during an 8-year period, there were 1,079 times the number of violent crimes committed by, between, and among the citizens of Chicago on each other than Americans supposedly committed in 8 years of combat in Vietnam. If this is all you have, you've just demonstrated that these 2.6 million guys were among the best behaved in history. They don't have anything even remotely approaching the crime rates you find in an ordinary American city. From another perspective, this is one of her great lines. This is, I think I quoted this before. An unparalleled body of evidence comprising 9,000 pages. All right, now 9,000 pages. I'll show you this right here. This is 100 pages. This is nothing. I was a prosecutor for 12 years. No prosecutor ever walked into a courtroom to prosecute a violent crime with a folder this thin. This would be a misdemeanor case. When you go in to prosecute a sexual assault, a battery, a robbery, you're going to have several hundred pages of documents. There were times when I would go up there with bankers' boxes of documents. But just for the sake of calculation, to do a little math, let's say for the sake of discussion that you produce 200 pages of documentation for a violent offense. Just for mathematical purposes, in 2007 we had 34,895 violent crimes. If you get 200 from each one, the authorities in Chicago would produce 6,979,000 pages of documentation for the offenses committed in the city of Chicago. If you compare the 8-year period at 200 pages per violent offense, you have 64,757,000 pages of reports. And I guarantee you, you have a lot more than that. That's assuming a minimum number, okay? Once again, what this demonstrates is how well behaved the guys were in Vietnam. But the thing you have to understand about people like Deborah Nelson, she's an ideologue. She's a party intellectual in the Orwellian sense, and she will see exactly what she wants to see when she looks at this. I will guarantee you, and this is not hyperbole or exaggeration, the authorities in the city of Chicago, I will guarantee you, produce 9,000 pages of material in connection with violent crimes every hour, 24 hours a day. There's no question about it. So what does she demonstrate? Her thesis is spectacularly self-destructive. All you have to do is look at it. But you can't call her a liar. She's not a liar. She believes this because she has to believe it. They've convinced themselves of it. And lastly, when you have to consider some elephants in the room. Elephants in the room, this is something that comes from 12-step programs. Everybody knows it's a giant thing that nobody wants to talk about. It's there for all to see. And for a start, think about this. Again, according to the war crimes industry and the people who promoted it and still promote it, you have in this society, to everyone's knowledge, apparently tens of thousands of raping, torturing, murdering war criminals walking around free all day. And the Chicago Tribune, noting that we still pursued Nazi war criminals, and I read the New York Times every day of my life, and not a year goes by that you don't read about a couple of these 90-year-old guys being dragged out of a hole somewhere. They recently put on trial an individual who was just a clerk at Auschwitz. He kept books, but he was tried as a war criminal. Now, this is what the editors of the Chicago Tribune say. Those who commit these atrocities may think that they will never answer for their crimes, but the pursuit of these Nazis tells dictators, thugs, murderers, and henchmen around the world that crimes against humanity won't be overlooked or forgotten. Well, if anybody actually believes that we're the criminals they say we are, don't you think it's time we started prosecuting some of our own guys for this? I mean, shouldn't John Kerry, as noble as he presents himself to be the one to stand up and say, we've got to start prosecuting these guys? How can we prosecute these Germans and let tens of thousands of our own just go free? Do you think maybe it's because everybody knows it's all nonsense? Okay? Consider as well all around here in the last couple of years. They've started pulling down Confederate monuments because they were bad guys. They were on the wrong side of a war. Well, if 1/10 of what John Kerry says is true, the Vietnam Memorial should be demolished. And anyone who believes a word of what he says should be in the forefront of demanding that, because it's a national disgrace. But nobody ever asks for that to happen. Why? Because it's nonsense and they know it. If you study just a little bit about what these anti-war people today have to say about veterans, it's amazing. David Harris, who was a very famous, he was married to Joan Baez and he refused induction. And he says in his own book that he refused to serve in Vietnam because it was no different than fighting for the Nazis. And yet he says this: America's political leaders are the villains of the piece and not the guys that went and did what they forced them to do. Those guys I commiserate with, and I always had a good relationship with the veterans. So apparently, obedience to orders is a defense for us. David Harris has been denouncing the veterans and their crimes for decades, but it's perfectly okay, apparently, because they're Americans. There's another elephant in the room. It doesn't make any sense at all. And lastly, if you look at John Kerry's timeline, in 1971, he accused us of all these horrible atrocities. On Meet the Press in 71, he accused his country of genocide, and he declared that thousands of his fellow veterans committed war crimes that were ordered as a matter of established policy by the government of the United States from the top down. That's what he maintained as of 1971. In 2004, when he ran for president, this was all gone. In 2004, I actually watched him on TV speaking with great pride of his service in Vietnam. He made it the center of his political campaign. He bragged that the veterans never lost a battle, and this is on his website. Make no mistake, American intentions were noble, and no soldiers have ever fought with more bravery or selflessness for their country. Nobody in the media says a word about this. This is a spectacular turnabout. Nobody in the commentariat said, Mr. Kerry, what happened since 2001? Because for 30 years they told us they were all criminals. Now they're great guys engaged in a noble purpose. In 2006, he's back on the radio saying that he told the truth when he returned from Vietnam. So now we're back to being criminals again. And he wrote in his 2018 book that he told the truth. And once again, so now we're back to being criminals. Absolutely no one takes note of this. That's another elephant in the room. Somebody should be asking Mr. Kerry why he goes back and forth. But you see, they really don't, for a very simple reason. And this is really the bottom line. The war crimes industry took place as a matter of tactics and strategy. We were never engaged in this conduct. The anti-war left knew we weren't engaged in this conduct, but it was essential to say that we were, because basically we were the enemy. And you always demonize the enemy in a war. And I compare this to the British upper class. If you've ever read The Education of Henry Adams was in London during the Civil War. And a lot of members of the British upper class absolutely hated Abraham Lincoln, and they hated the Civil War because it was hurting their pocketbooks. They made fortunes based on cheap cotton from slave labor. And this is what Henry Adams wrote. This is a great quote. The coarse cruelty of Abraham Lincoln and his hirelings was notorious. Thackeray never doubted that the Federals made a business of harrowing the tenderest feelings of women, particularly of women, in order to punish their opponents. On quite insufficient evidence, he burst into violent reproach. Had Adams carried in his pocket the proofs that the reproach was unjust, he would have gained nothing by showing them. At that moment, Thackeray, and all of London society with him, needed the nervous relief of expressing emotion. For if Mr. Lincoln was not what they said he was, what were they? And that's what you need to remember about the war crimes industry and the men who served in Vietnam. If you call attention to these things, if you discuss these things, you're calling attention to a rather ugly aspect of American history that no one really wants to talk about. And it's something in which the media in this country have been very, very complicit. So the reason why nobody wants to talk about this is because if we're not what they said we were, and we're not, what are they? That's the question you have to ask yourself, and I think anybody knows the answer. And with that, if anyone has any questions? Yes.
I would imagine that when it comes to My Lai, which you referred to, would that be one instance where there is sufficient evidence to show that there was a massacre of some
Yes.
kind?
Yes, absolutely. I would never maintain and have never maintained that these things did not occur. They did occur, all right? The question is, if you really study World War II history, you read good books by Stephen Ambrose like Americans at War. Americans did this kind of stuff all the time in World War II, particularly in the Pacific. They did not, the Marines would brag about the fact that if you want to take prisoners, you better try to surrender to the Army. And they killed Japanese. They didn't let them surrender. The Germans were killed in World War II. I note in this book, I go considerably through an analysis of that to demonstrate there was a lot of it. There's a lot of it that goes on. The key is it the exception or the rule? Is it done with the approval of the authorities? That's a huge difference. Yes, they did happen, and people were prosecuted when these things were in fact determined to have happened. I'd never deny that they happened, but they did not happen on a regular basis. They were not part and parcel of our work in Vietnam, and it was not done with command input. It just wasn't. Yes, sir.
Neal, I operated in that area around My Lai, and I was there sometime after. That was a heavily VC infested area, and this does not excuse what happened there, but it does add a little bit of context that what those guys responded to, and I'm not excusing what they did. I want to say that again, but what they were responding to was a hostile environment where you really did not know the enemy.
I understand that.
And because it was primarily Viet Cong that they were, even after the My Lai incident, it was called Pinktown.
Yep.
A friend of mine was in Pinktown right after it happened. They were the replacement for Callie's group. He told me even after the My Lai incident that area continued with the type of hostilities that those guys at Callie's outfit dealt with. So it doesn't, on no level does it excuse lining up, putting a couple hundred women and children in a ditch and but this was not something where they just went out for a stroll that day and said, well, we're just going to go kill a bunch of people. There was context to that story.
I understand that.
That doesn't mitigate it, but it at least explains what was in their mind at the time. I do have a question for you. It was in chapter 12 of your book, which is an excellent read. Did you just get, it was Nelson that used the Nazi quote? Was that Nelson? Was it John Nelson?
Not that I recall.
Okay, but it was the one that was like going to fight for the Nazis that they.
Oh, David Harris.
David Harris.
He expressly states in his book that he based his refusal to serve on the Nuremberg principles and says that he faced the same choice faced by Germans and he feels that he passed the test, which again speaks volumes about the rest of us.
Okay, so I found that interesting when I read that piece, that there was a, how do I want to say it, there was a sense that if we were going to fight against the Nazis, that was a good war.
Yes.
But fighting against the communists made it a less good war. Maybe I was reading too much into that quote, but somehow I saw the left aligning themselves with the communists. Was that influence in there? Did you get that?
Yeah, and see, the thing is that you really need to, if you're gonna, I say this all the time, you will never understand the Vietnam War by reading about the Vietnam War.
Right.
You need vastly more context, and I go through this at the end of one chapter, all right? The Vietnam War was part of the Truman Doctrine. It was no different than any other campaign in the Truman Doctrine, except for the fact that we lost it. And if you look at it on any broad political or philosophical or moral basis, if we were wrong in Vietnam, then we were wrong across the board from the day we started the Truman Doctrine. We were wrong in Greece, we were wrong in China, we were wrong in the Philippines, we were wrong across the board. It was all part of the same half-century campaign. That is a conversation worth having. Should we have done any of this? By the time we were done in Korea, we had killed nearly 20% of that country's pre-war civilian population. What we did in Korea was just devastating. It was awful. And I haven't seen any historian yet justify it, other than because of domestic politics. And the conversation Americans need to have is, what did we gain from the Truman Doctrine and the Cold War, and what did it cost us? But what you cannot do is focus on Vietnam and say, well, this one was different. No, it wasn't. Other than the fact that we gave it away, that's what makes it different. So the question is, should we have done any of this? Not what did we do? Did you have a question?
That's my story.
Yeah, the analysis that you've done in your body of work, did you watch this Ken Burns Vietnam
Yes.
series critically?
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't care for it. It's just the same story. You could, virtually every book you read about the Vietnam War is the same story. It all goes back to the best and the brightest, and the reporters in Saigon, and the non-viability of the Saigon regime. The one thing I determined, I mean, I can't tell you how many hundreds of books I've read on it, but basically, with the exception of a few, it's all the same story. It doesn't matter which one you read. You can read, of course, David Halberstam, he's the one where it really started, but I can't even think of the names of so many of them. Stanley Carnow, who was one of the reporters in Saigon, they all write the same story. And that's why I've said so many times, you can't learn about the Vietnam War by reading about the Vietnam War. You need context. You have to go all the way back to the politics of Korea. Korea defined what was going to be done in Vietnam. If you understand what happened in Korea, then you know why everyone did what they did in Vietnam. Yes, sir.
I just want to comment about John Kerry, who's not a favorite of mine. And I can't remember the book that came out just before he was running for president. Was probably, Kerry was going to use that as part of his campaign.
Probably David or Douglas Brinkley's
Douglas
biography.
Brinkley, thank you. If you read everything about what Kerry did in his service on the PT boats and before that on a cruiser or something, there's nothing in that book that I recall that he offers as evidence that he observed any of these.
There's
atrocities.
nothing in his 2018 autobiography about that either. And, again, he says whatever he thinks an audience wants to hear.
Yeah.
Is that it then?
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.